Thanks, John. So as John mentioned, I'm working for the Department of Economic Development based out of Rutherglen, and one of the main parts of my work is to manage the Livestock Farm Monitor project. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But one of the interesting things that came out of that for me is what are some of the learnings that we can take from that in terms of things that we might be able to take away as individuals that might improve our own business. So these are some of the questions that hopefully if you've come to a conference like this, you're possibly asking yourself as Sean is thinking about. So how can I make my farm more profitable? Is there something that I can learn from the better operators in the business, and what are these top farmers doing consistently well? And some of us had the privilege to hear David Parkin talk last night, and one of the things he said was that it's important to be passionate about what you do, and I think that passion is one of the reasons, hopefully, why you've all come along to this conference. But also he talked about choice, and so profitability in some ways in a farming business is a choice. So you even by deciding to come here is a choice that you've made that is probably going to flow through and improve your farm business. So it's always always facing with choices, and you've made a decision in some ways that you would like to be more profitable. So a little bit about the Livestock Farm Monitor project. It's a financial and production benchmarking project. Some of you might be familiar with it, others aren't. It's at the moment a partnership between ourselves and Rural Finance. It's been running since the 70s, down as the Southwest Farm Monitor report. And last year we had 76 participants. We're about to go and start collecting data again this year, so it's done once a year. It's split up into 3 regions, so Gippsland, the northern part of the state, so not sort of Mildura Swan Hill, but that sort of northeast, and the southwest. And we report on 3 industries, so wool and lamb as sort of separate industries, and then beef. And a lot of the participants have a mix of some or all of those enterprises. We also report on cropping where it's sort of part of that livestock enterprise, but we haven't got people who are cropping 2,000 and 3,000 hectares sort of thing. So the value for the government, I suppose, and industry is that it provides a snapshot once a year as to how the livestock industries are performing, and so that's useful for policymakers, it's useful for researchers, it's useful for industry, but where it becomes really interesting and valuable for individuals is when you start looking at comparing the average in that report to how the top 20% are performing. So one of the main measures that we report on is this term of EBIT, so earnings before interest and tax. So ultimately it's how much profit you've made, but it's before you've had any interest or lease costs deducted. So it's, if you like, doesn't complicate the story with how much debt you happen to have. So it enables me to compare my farm to somebody else, even though we might have vastly different borrowings on that farm. So it's really how well you're managing that farm. And that's the way we rank the top 20%. So they're the top 20% in terms of EBIT. And so one of the valuable things is to think about, well, what are some of the things that those guys in the top 20% are doing that's put them there? So the data, a lot of the data can tell us this, and this is just a bit of a snapshot of some of the data that's come out of it. So this is the last 10 years averaged out, so it'll have ups and downs, dry years, good years, bad prices, all that sort of stuff. So don't get too hung up on the actual dollar figures, but some of the trends there are really interesting. So gross income, the top 20% guys are actually turning over considerably more per hectare. And I've picked per hectare figure just because it's easy. It's not necessarily the best figure to use. The report also reports on things like per DSE and per hectare per 100 millimetres of rainfall, which is actually another good measure. And if you're interested, you can go on to, it's actually still hosted on the DEPI website. So if you wanted to go back and drill into some of this data a bit more, the last, I think, 5 years worth of reports are on the DEPI website. So you can go and have a look there and play with the reports. But anyway, enterprise and variable costs are generally actually a bit higher with those guys who are more profitable, and I'll touch on that in a sec. But basically it means that they're spending money to make money. Their overhead costs don't vary much. Owner-operator allowance is slightly less, and the owner-operator allowance is just a figure that we calculate to reflect the amount of labour that the owner spends in the business, regardless of how much drawings they take. And so that gives us this EBIT figure. And as you can see there, the top 20% are basically making 3 times as much money. So what are some of the things that those guys are doing that we might be able to learn from? This return on assets is really that EBIT just reported as a percentage against the assets that they manage. And so here's one of the main drives, and Jason talked about that this morning, is that they're running a higher stocking rate in general. And so that's one of the drivers. But some of the others, well, there it is, the first one, higher stocking rate. So that's one of the main things that consistently leaps out, that these guys are running higher stocking rates. Higher gross income per hectare, and that's probably reflected from the high stocking rate. They're actually spending more on pasture costs, so things like, and that second last point as well, fertiliser is reflected in there as well. So they're spending more on seed, they're spending more on chemicals, they're spending more on fertiliser. So some of the things that we can read from that is that they're growing more grass and utilising it well. And if you've come to any of these conferences, you're involved in the industry, there's not any great secrets, I don't think, in that. On the other side of the coin, they're actually spending less on supplementary feed. So they're growing the grass on the place, they're not bringing feed in. They're got slightly higher labour efficiency as well. So that's what has spits out from the data. So the other point about this top 20% is that it's bloody hard to get there, and it's also really hard to stay in that top 20%. So I had a look at the last 5 years worth of data, 169 participants. There's 2 people been able to be in the top 20% for all 5 years. And then small numbers who have been in there for 4 years running or 3 years or whatever it is. So it's really hard to get there, and it's even harder to stay there. So the next bit of what I'm going to talk about is some of the other things that might be influencing that. Now, just because you're not in the top 20% doesn't mean that you're not making money, and it also doesn't mean that if you move out of the top 20%, doesn't mean that you've done something different or something wrong. Often what will happen is that if you have a year with high rainfall in a particular area, is that sometimes somebody will leapfrog into the top 20% and push you out or whatever it is. So, it's all this is just talking about general trends, and so none of this is sort of, stand up to any scientific rigour or anything, what I'm going to talk about, but it's just some of the things, some observations that come out of this. So anyway, I thought, what are these top 20% guys who can regularly be in there, what are they doing? And what are they doing that isn't in the data? So I asked them, and so I spent some time either visiting them or talking to them on the phone. A number of them I'd already had contact with. So I asked them some of the things and split up, and I've then split them up into sort of 3 broad categories in terms of personal or personality type things, the farm system, and also business. So there's Sean, the sheep there, reading the Weekly Times, and that's one of the things they do, I think. But one of the other things they do is they love talking about their farms. And so all these guys, I couldn't get them off the phone most of the time. They spend an hour or 2 hours talking on the phone about their farm, and they they just love what they're doing, and they're wanting to talk about it, and they're wanting to bounce ideas off me. I mean, I'm not a technical expert in, lambing percentages or any of those sorts of things, but they wanted to run all these ideas past me, and there's some stuff started to come out of there that I thought, this is really interesting. They just love talking about their farm. They're driven and passionate, and there's no great surprise in that. If you're passionate about something, it's going to give you drive, and you're going to be good at it. My young fellow who's doing VCE at the moment, the teachers say to him, do the subjects that you like, because they'll be the ones that you're good at. And so these guys are the same. They really like what they're doing, they're passionate about it, and then that's translating into them actually being good at it. They're hungry for knowledge, and in fact, just by being here is one of the first things that you could do to try and improve your profitability. They're hungry for that knowledge. And the Weekly Times story, one of the guys said to me that, he doesn't just read the Weekly Times, he reads it, and then if he sees an article of interest, he'll track the bloke down and ring him and say, can I come and visit you, or can I, suck your brain about what it is you're doing. So they're really thirsty for knowledge and information. They've got a mindset to manage properly, and so what does properly mean? And I suppose it goes back to some of that knowledge that they're getting. They'll come to a workshop or a conference and hear about some stuff, and they think, well, actually, I really would like to try and achieve that, because the evidence says that that's what we should be doing. So they've got this mindset that says that they really want to be making the most out of this farm and making the most money out of this farm as well. They've got an appetite to take on risk. So we all know that you can't really grow your business or grow your wealth without taking on some level of risk, and these guys are all willing to take on some risk. And that might mean that they go and borrow a heap of money and buy another farm or do something different, but they're all willing to take on some of that risk. But also, you also need to think that risk is a very personal thing, and it also can vary. Your attitude to risk might vary during your life. So if you're, 30 or 40, then a heap of risk might sit really comfortably with you. If you're a bit older, then it mightn't be so comfortable. So, there's some of the things just to think about when you talk about risk. But one of the guys also said that having taken on a bit more debt has really put him on his toes. So it's interesting. They all, and this isn't an ad for the Best Wool Best Lamb Network or the Better Beef Group Network or whatever, but they are all part of a network or a discussion group. So it might be a formal Best Wool Best Lamb group, or it might be a group that has, broken away after a few years and those guys all stay together, or it might be just a group of mates who meet on a regular basis for a beer and a pizza on a Friday night and talk about what's happening on their farm. So they're all doing this. And also a number of them will be just ringing their neighbours and their friends and their mates, and it'll be 8 o'clock on a Friday night, and Collingwood might be 20 goals in front, and they think, well, this is not interesting anymore. So they pick up the phone and ring their mate and just say, oh, what's going on the farm this week? And they're really wanting to talk and suck other people's knowledge and really learn from other people that they're associating with. They've found their sweet spot. And so that might be in terms of the size of their enterprise. So they might be really comfortable that, we can run this farm with the amount of labour we've got. We can still have 2 weeks away at school holidays if we want to. We can do this sustainably with this size enterprise and the way we're doing it. But also in terms of industry. So if you're a beef man, just because lamb potentially is a bit more profitable, don't necessarily just go and grow lamb for that reason. Again, it comes down to what you're passionate about, then that's what you should focus on. So find your little sweet spot where you really enjoy working, and that'll translate through to your passion, and it'll translate through to you doing it well. They're not afraid to think outside the square, and in terms of, they've got really open, inquiring minds. And so if something comes along, that might be a little bit different, they don't dismiss it. They're really thirsty for knowledge and thirsty to think about new and different things. So that's sort of the personal stuff. The next little category I looked at was sort of the farm system, and that's Sean pushing the farm system. And that's what a lot of these guys, that's what they all are doing, is pushing their system. And so we get that out of the data by, if you like, their higher stocking rates, but they're all really pushing that system on the edge. And that's not saying that they're, raping and pillaging the land. They're doing it sensibly, they're doing it, sustainably, but they're really pushing that system. Most of them have got some multiple enterprises, and so that's a little bit about spreading the risk across, beef or lamb or wool or whatever it happens to be. But also there's some complementarity between some of those enterprises that, the cattle might follow the sheep well in the system, or they might have a little bit of cropping and then they can use that to graze stubbles, all those sorts of things. So there's some complementarity, but not too many enterprises. So, once they get to the point of having maybe more than about 2 or 3 enterprises, it starts getting too complicated, too complex, and they start not doing any of them particularly well. So don't go too overboard. They've got an intimate knowledge of the farm. A number of these guys are on a family farm, and that didn't translate necessarily to the fact that they, took over a family farm with no debt, and therefore that's why they're profitable. But what I saw that translating to is that they really knew that land well. So they knew that, in 1970 we grow a heap of, feed down on those flats because, we got rain at this time. So they really know that land well. They really know how to get the most from that land. So, and that's difficult, obviously, if you come into and you're buying or leasing a new property. But the more, I suppose, research and the more you can get to know about that land, the better off you're going to be. They seek advice when required. So they're not scared to go and spend a bit of money on a consultant, or they're not scared to get an agronomist in if they, if they want to get some advice on pastures or whatever. So there's that, that comes back to that mindset of that open, inquiring mind. They're happy to pay for that advice when they need to and see it as being money pretty well spent. They buy good genetics, but they don't get all that hung up on it. So, some of them might, be following sort of land plan or some of those genetic, measurement programs or whatever, but they don't get totally hung up on them. So, and also they focus on some of the genetics that really mean something to them. So, for instance, if they're wanting to reduce their birth weights or something in calves, then they will go out and look for some genetics that's going to do that. So they really work out what bit of that whole genetic story is important to them at that period of time. They might focus on that, but they don't get totally hung up on it. And again, they measure the things that matter to them. So they're not measuring everything that's happening on the farm, but most of these guys are taking some really, useful measurements for them. There's a couple of anal ones who have got spreadsheets with everything on them and all that sort of stuff, but mostly they're working out what matters to me, and I'll go and measure that. So that might be condition scoring ewes, or it might be, measuring lamb percentages, or it might be weighing animals as they're growing ready for market. They work out what's important for me, and I suppose they're doing it using their time efficiently. So measure the stuff that's useful for them in their system. Doing regular soil testing and using fertiliser judiciously. So they're fertilising, but they're not just going out and blanket fertilising the whole place. They're doing soil testing, they're getting advice, they're thinking through the numbers, is that economically viable for me to put that amount of fertiliser on? Yes, well, let's go and do it. And in fact, one of the guys said to me, it's the best money he spends on the farm. So they're all using, fertiliser wisely, but they're certainly using it. They rotationally graze to a degree. So most of them, because they've been involved in some sort of an industry, discussion group or network or whatever, they've often gone and learnt the skills. So some of it might be back to the old beef check days, even when they learnt some of the skills about rotationally grazing or measuring pastures or whatever. So they've got some of those skills, they've learnt them, and they're sort of almost reverting back, a lot of them, to just doing it by gut feel now. So, they mightn't necessarily be out there with their little pasture calculator, but they're still thinking in that same way. So again, they've taken that bit of industry knowledge, they've learned how to use it, and they've, if you like, tailored it for what they want to do on their own property. The other thing in terms of the farm system is a lot of them are leasing some country, so they will have something opportunistic that might come up, like for instance a neighbour's place or a paddock might come up next door for a couple of years and they decide that that's too good an opportunity to miss, or they might be strategically using leasing as a way of growing their business. So I think every one of the guys that I spoke to have got some sort of lease as part of their farm system. So then I thought about the business side of things. Well, what are they doing from a business perspective? And guess what? They're treating it like a business. So they're not treating it like a hobby. They're not treating it like something they do on the weekend or a lifestyle or anything. They're actually running this thing like a business, like they would be running any other business that wasn't farming. They're really thinking about it in that respect. And so that comes back to that they're looking at their returns every year. They're seeing what they can change, how they can improve it. They're doing cash flow budgeting, and a number of them are even doing things like comparing budgets to actuals as they go through the year. So I think the numbers are something like about only 40% of farmers actually do a cash flow budget, and then only about 40% of those use it. And then a lot of those guys who are doing it are really only doing it because the bank manager tells them to. These people actually use it as a really important management tool, so they know how that farm is going to perform in the next 12 months. They've done a bit of playing around with some scenarios that if land prices go to this, I'm going to make this money, or I can, if land prices drop to this, my farm business can cope with it, all those sorts of things. So these guys are actually doing it. So, I think that's a big tick for those sort of skills. They've usually got a business plan and it's usually written down and reviewed. So it might be something that says in the next 5 years we want to grow the business or do this or do that or whatever. Or it might be something that's out to 20 years. It might involve how different family members are involved in the farm, all those sorts of things. So they're actually, again, treating it like a business. They're doing a business plan and reviewing it as they go along. They've got the capacity to get through difficult times, and so that capacity has sort of got a couple of bits to it. They have, I suppose, the financial capacity, so when they're having the decisions that they make in good years are as important in bad years. So they might be building up some either off-farm assets, or they might be putting away money, or they might be spending money on infrastructure in those good years. That means that when things get a bit tight, they've actually got the capacity to keep making money and keep growing. But also they've got some mental capacity because they now know that they've been through a couple of tough years. They might have been through a commodity price that's dropped away, and they've actually come through the other side of it really strong. So it's given them that confidence that they know that they can actually work through something that's a bit tough. And I think that some of them reflected that that's probably meant that their trigger finger isn't quite as trigger happy as it might be. So, for instance, if the spring goes a bit dry, they're not quite as keen to sell off all animals early and all those sorts of things because they just sort of have been through some of that stuff before. So there's that wisdom and knowledge of having been through it that's obviously pretty hard to get without having made mistakes along the way, I think. Most of them are selling direct. So they might be selling direct to the abattoirs or the processor, or they might be selling direct to a feedlot and really only using the market to sort of tidy up tail ends and things like that. And most of them are still using an agent, even though some of them are a bit reluctant and a bit uncomfortable that maybe it's costing them money. But what they've said is that use an agent, but make sure he's really working for you. So they can see benefit in using an agent. Even though they might be selling direct, they're still using the agent, but they're really making that guy or girl, work for their money. So they're using an agent who can add value to their business. And in terms of the direct selling as well, quite a few of them said that once or twice a year they'll go down to the meatworks and they'll actually follow their animals going through the system. So they're actually getting really good feedback about what they're doing, and they're developing really good relationships with those guys that they're selling to. They're using contractors and contract labour as required, and so again that's probably a business skill in terms of delegation. So when they have periods of peak work, or they have tasks that need some specialised expertise. They go out and buy that labour essentially. So they've worked out what they're good at and what they're not good at, and they bring in people to do the stuff that they're not really so good at themselves. So there's that delegation aspect, I suppose. So there's sort of there's some of the little observations that have come out of it. Whether there's anything there that you take away and think, well, that's something I might do differently on my place. Split up in terms of the personality and the personal stuff. Sometimes those things are things you can't change, and that it depends what your personality is. But some of the other things in terms of the farm system and treating it like a business, you maybe got some capacity to change. And one of the other things that they've said is that we still make heaps of mistakes, but we learn from them. So that's really important too. So good luck.
We still have a couple of minutes for questions. Are there any questions? Yep. Just make sure you repeat them.
What's the age bracket of these blokes, this top 20%?
Yeah, the question was what the age bracket is of the guys who are in this top 20%. And they're all over the place, really. So although some of the ones who are sort of in that older age bracket often have got a younger generation that are coming through. So it's then hard to say, well, are they old or are they young? Because they're in the one business sort of thing. But yeah, they are all over the place. Yep.
Earlier on one of the first slides, you had the supplementary feed costs.
Yep.
Does that cost? Is that there just if they buy it in off farm, or is that? No.
So the question was about supplementary feed costs that we talked about earlier. When we do the report, feed bought into the farm is captured, but also homegrown feed is captured and put a value across that as well. Yep.